This is Gareth's second appearance on the podcast. It is the political fallout from everything covered in our first episode, where he told the story for how he serendipitously uncovered Opus Dei's hidden power and financial manipulation while investigating the ruins of the Spanish bank Banco Popular. It began as a routine story but evolved into the discovery of a global network of manipulation, coercive recruitment, psychological abuse, and enormous financial flows routed through myriad opaque foundations. Gareth spoke about how Opus Dei maintains a polished, benign public image, but secretly operates an inner core of numeraries, members bound by vows of obedience, chastity, and poverty, who are tightly controlled, isolated, and always monitored. Its systematic practices include corporal mortification, made famous in Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, constant surveillance, abuse, both emotional and physical, and the exploitation of vulnerable young women tantamount to human trafficking. In fact, Gareth directly makes the claim that Opus Dei does conduct human trafficking. This is a direct quote from Gareth's first appearance on the show. This is an organization that seeks to re-Christianize the entire world. Opus Dei are enormously successful in their ambitious pursuits, but they are informed by a warped, conservative, radical reading of the Bible. What they do is embed themselves inside key institutions, especially in the United States, and despite their Vatican legitimacy, Opus Dei uses secrecy and corporate structures to evade accountability. So this podcast is the political fallout, the smear campaign against Gareth, and all the rest that came from his incredible book, Opus. And it's been a while since I have encouraged my dear listeners to do this, but if you have the time, I would really appreciate it if you could leave a review, whether that's on Apple or Spotify. Nothing does more to further propel this podcast into the ears of others, and therefore grow the show, and therefore make my show more legitimate when I put it in front of the next guest that I want to interview. So I would ask you all to do that, and with absolutely no further ado, here is Gareth Gore.
Well, first of all, Ryan, thank you for having me back. It's a pleasure to be back on the show. I'm surprised you still want to talk to me after our mammoth session last time, but it's, I mean, this topic is so immense that there's always more to talk about. Okay. Political links and Project 2025. I mean, look, I think we should start this by saying that this is not some kind of crazy conspiracy theory. I'm not implying that the head of Opus Dei is sat in Rome issuing orders to Donald Trump or to whoever, telling them kind of what legislation to push through. That isn't the way that Opus Dei works. I think the best way to think about Opus Dei is as a network. Wherever they set up in the world, and generally they set up in these kind of nucleuses of nuclei of power around the world. So that they'll set up in London, in Washington, DC, in Sydney, in cities where decisions are made. And once they set up, they will generally target people who are in positions of power. Now, this has been the way they've operated right since the beginning. In the early 1930s, when José María Escrivá, the founder, was setting up the organization and writing down the blueprint, the rules for how it would operate as it expanded around the world. He was very he was very detailed about how people should go after potential recruits, who they should recruit. He made it quite clear that they should be targeting people atop the mountain, because his used his analogy that, from the top of the mountain, the snow melts and flows down into society. So if you want to influence society, you have to target people at the top. And that's what they've always done. Right through in the Franco years, they very much targeted the kind of intellectual elite. They very successfully inserted themselves into government and into business, journalism. And that's, and if we look at somewhere like Washington, DC, one small stat for you. In the US, Opus Dei has about 3,000 members. You would expect those members to be concentrated in kind of predominantly Catholic cities like New York, Boston, Chicago, Miami these days because of the large Latino population. But no, the largest contingent of Opus Dei members is in Washington, D.C., 800 of 3,000 members. So roughly a quarter of its members are in the D.C. area. And that tells you all you need to know about where it's focused its recruitment efforts And that's because it wants to infiltrate the political, legal, lobbying elite. And so, like, a few names for you: Kevin Roberts. I mean, this kind of is the direct link to Project 2025. Kevin Roberts, the president of the Heritage Foundation, a man who in recent weeks has been, we're recording this in November 2020. In recent weeks, he's been at the center of this scandal because he's been defending the platforming of this ultra right-wing figure, Nick Fuentes. And he is a regular at the Opus Dei Center in central Washington, D.C. He gets his spiritual formation from an Opus Dei priest. He's very much part of this Opus Dei network. He's given speeches where he talks about how he looks up to Escrivá. This is the guy who the Heritage Foundation is Project 2025. They're the ones that created this blueprint for a second Trump administration. Of how that administration could really kind of tear up the way that the American system of government works and kind of rewire that in order to kind of push forward their agenda. So we know that the president of the Heritage Foundation, the guy who's basically the brains behind Project 20, very close to Opus Dei. He goes to the Opus Dei Center once a week, gets direction from them, talks about how he looks up to Escrivá. Project 2025 is made up of literally hundreds of different people. Not all of them are linked to Opus Dei, but there's a bunch of people who are linked to Opus Dei. So I think the connections are there. And many of the people involved are part of this Opus Dei network. Some of them are members. Some of them are just affiliates. Some of them are, I guess, admirers of Opus Dei. But, we should be clear as well that, Opus Dei isn't issuing orders to Kevin Roberts to do this. They're more of a kind of they're trying to influence people like him and trying to infiltrate those kinds of worlds. But also there are other, the one thing we know about the Trump administration is that it's this kind of hodgepodge mix of lots of different interests, from Silicon Valley to Christian nationalists to kind of, it's just a big
whatever
mix
furthers his interests.
Exactly. And also it's the same for many of these groups as well. I mean, I think a lot of these groups, including, a lot of the Christian nationalists and including a lot of the Opus Dei types, I think a lot of them look at Trump and are disgusted at what he stands for, and especially his kind of moral compass, some of the things he's done in the past, but they see him as a means to an end. I think, it's probably quite similar during the Franco years. I think in Spain, a lot of devout Catholics looked at Franco and, were very uncomfortable with many of the atrocities he'd committed. The fact that hundreds of thousands of people have been locked up in these kind of concentration camps. Tens of thousands of people of his political opponents have been murdered. He was a ruthless, bloodthirsty dictator, even, during peacetime. This is after the war. But I think a lot of kind of devout Catholics turned a blind eye because he was...
Because he was a vessel of power.
He was a vessel of power, and he was better than the communists. He was better than at least in their eyes. And so, I think we have a similar thing going on right now. So you have a lot of these ultra devout Catholics who are very close to Trump and very close to Project 2025. And, getting into bed with him is kind of a necessary evil to further their agenda.
So it's not just the ideological overlap, but there is a direct link to political influence with Roberts. What is Roberts' significance in all of it? Has Opus Dei directly impacted policy in the last 2 years?
I mean, I think the answer to that is no. Opus Dei hasn't directly impacted policy. The whole point of Opus Dei is that it does everything indirectly. What it's doing when it kind of infiltrates a political network, what it's doing is kind of, first of all, trying to pull people into its orbit. And it does that it doesn't show all of its cards, immediately. It does that by saying, we're a Catholic organization. We want to help people like you to get deeper into their faith. Let us help you out. Come to confession, come to our meetings. And then once they kind of reel you in, it then begin to offer you these additional kind of sessions where I guess they're called spiritual guidance. They're trying to help you to, I guess, live out your faith in your daily job. And, if these guys are politicians or lawyers, then that means influencing the way that they think about how Catholicism fits with, legislation that they might be helping to kind of push through Congress, or a court case that they're hearing at the moment. So yes, all of this work it's all indirect. And so I think, so I think we can't say that they have any kind of direct influence, but it's about creating these pockets, these networks in DC and in other cities, where they're able to maybe, I guess, suggest things, shape the agenda, and also critically connect people. So it's about being able to draw on this reliable network of individuals who are like-minded, are kind of, who are thinking about things in the same way, who are well connected, who have money behind them, and so that they can kind of, push forward their kind of reactionary agenda. And, and that is also kind of what Project 2025 is about. I mean, Trump, it's a playbook. Trump has used some of the suggestions from Project 2025. He's pushed them through. Others, he hasn't. And so, but what Project 2025 is about having this kind of ready, set list of ideas, and also a bunch of people who can kind of implement those ideas, and the kind of money around them through Leonard Leo, who's another Opus Dei affiliated person, who can kind of, so it's about kind of creating the conditions for these things to be able to happen. And this is happening all around the world. It's not just, the US, but in any country where the, Opus Dei is operating. I mean, I since putting the book out, I've had so many former and current members kind of reach out to me to kind of thank me for writing the book, and also to confirm, what I already knew. And, I remember I had one guy from Mexico who told me about how he'd been charged with basically infiltrating the families of the kind of ruling elite, including the Mexican president and a number of cabinet members. His job was to go in and kind of basically offer up the kind of spiritual guidance.
Wow.
To basically kind of lure them in kind of slowly and say, hey, we want to help you to be better Catholics. And then, it's about bringing these people into the network. And then once they're in, that's when, the priests and the numinaries who are in charge of spiritual guidance can really kind of get their teeth in and start to, I guess, influence the way that some of these people think about policy and just about the role that they should play in society.
What about some of the other serendipitous encounters you would have had since the book was published? Who else has reached out to you? What other sort of new sources or information has been brought to light?
I mean, it's been a wild ride since the book came out. I think, I mean, in the months before the book came out, I mean, it was also quite interesting because Opus Dei was obviously very worried, and they hired some very aggressive lawyers in the US to come after me and to come after my publisher. The message was basically, if you publish this book, you guys, we're going to bankrupt you. We're going to take you to court. We're going to absolutely rinse you. Do you really want to publish this book? It's the whole kind of lawfare strategy of trying to intimidate.
Yeah.
So they tried that for a few months. I was very lucky that my publisher, Sam Manchester, was having none of it. They completely stood by me. They knew that a huge amount of work had gone into the book. They knew that the allegations that I was making in the book were absolutely bang on. So, they tried that for a few months. It didn't work. And then, literally, I think it was 4 days before the book came out. So we'd been quite punchy. I mean, we'd been debating whether or not we actually call a spade a spade. So we kind of assembled all this evidence, especially with all of, especially these young girls that were recruited as kind of servants in places like Argentina, but not just Argentina, all around the world. These girls who, and we're talking girls who were like 12, 13 years old, coerced into joining Opus Dei and then basically enslaved, forced to work for no money, kind of basically shipped around the world to wherever Opus Dei needed them. And one day, one day I basically had this kind of epiphany of like, shit, this is human trafficking, isn't it? And so, I kind of looked up various definitions of what human trafficking was. My editor was very supportive of me, calling this out. We discussed it with the Simon & Schuster lawyers, and, they were like, yeah, I think absolutely you have a case here. And we made a call, which felt, I mean, felt a little bit ballsy because we were the first ones to really kind of put our necks on the line and to call this for what it was. But then, and part of all of these kind of legal letters that we were receiving over the, in the months before the book came out were like, how dare you accuse us of this heinous crime? We've never been accused of this ever. Where's your evidence for this? But we stuck to it. And then literally 4 days before the book came out, I remember that day I received the latest kind of missive from the Opus Dei lawyers, and it was like 20, 30 pages of like, this is why you can't put the book out. This is what, whatever. I remember I got this at like 5 p.m. on a Friday, and I was due that evening to go out for dinner with my family to celebrate. Like, next week the book's going to come out. I've been working on this for years. Isn't this? Let's go have a like family celebration. So I got this letter, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to park this until Monday or until the weekend. The night's about going out to like celebrate the book. So we went out, and I got my kids quite young, so we went out for like an early dinner, and we were back home by like 8. And I switched on my phone, and suddenly all these messages were coming through because what had just happened was that in Argentina, federal prosecutors had formally accused Opus Dei of human trafficking. This thing that we'd been, so they had independently.
That was your scoop.
Well, I mean, they had independently conducted their own investigation and arrived at the same conclusions. And they're also lawyers, not unlike me, and they have the powers of the state to interview, investigate people, and that was quite special. So after all of this pressure, all of this attempt to intimidate us, we'd stood our ground, and then, we'd been vindicated by, prosecutors who'd been looking into the same thing. And so, that's kind of been one of the wild things since the book's come out. So this is kind of slowly kind of gathering speed. This case, there's going to be a trial in Argentina. Already 4 Opus Dei priests, very senior priests, have been called to defend their names. The deputy head of Opus Dei has been brought into this, and there are currently efforts to kind of name the head of Opus Dei in the case as well. So we may well have a trial. There may well be a trial where the head of Opus Dei has to stand trial in Argentina, which is incredible. But all through this, I mean, Opus Dei is doing its damn best to like not address any of these issues. So when instead of kind of, like addressing the very serious allegations of human trafficking or, abusing its members and the rest of it, instead they've tried to kind of create this almost alternative narrative. So it's, been pushing all this stuff. They've been creating these videos and pushing these stories where they're kind of basically trying to paint me as this kind of journalist with an agenda. They've implied that I've been paid by some kind of like George Soros type figure who wants to bring them down.
It's always George.
Yeah, it's always George. He's a busy guy, and he's like what, in his 90s or something. Like he's a. I know, and even implied that I'm like, somehow linked to the Ku Klux Klan or something, and like it's kind of crazy.
Oh my god!
But it's also very telling. I mean, I think what they don't realize is that by not engaging with these very serious allegations, any other organization in the world, if they were accused of these things, they would be like, shit. Yeah. We're going to launch a full investigation. We're going to cooperate with the authorities. If we find any wrongdoing whatsoever, we will come down hard on these people. They'll be thrown out. Is that what Opus Dei has done? No, they've just kind of created these completely fictitious narratives to try to distract people from the core arguments of the book. And that's quite telling. This isn't an organization that, this is supposed to be a Christian organization. They're meant to be, it's meant to be all about Christian values, but instead of actually trying to get to the truth, they're just trying to distract people. They have no interest in actually getting to the truth. They want to hide what's really been going on. And I think so it's been a wild year. I've had all kinds of crazy abuse online and like it's, but I guess it's also a window into the culture wars, right? I mean, people just they pick a side and they dig their heels in, and they almost don't want to listen to the evidence and the reality and the truth. They just want to defend the side that they've picked. It's kind of crazy.
Man.
kind of sad, actually.
You spoke about in our first interview about the Da Vinci Code and the efforts that Opus Dei went through in their PR machine to either fight back against its message or even try to shut it down. And when we spoke, you were anticipating all of these efforts that were going to be made against you. And you've documented a few of them here, but I wonder if there are any particular stories or examples that have stood out in the last year since the book has been published that might be indicative of this PR machine, apart from them just denying all outright everything you say, trying to paint you as a George Soros guy or a Ku Klux Klan guy, but rather anything more malicious than that as well.
I mean, one of the most interesting ones was in Spain. I mean, obviously, Spain is the biggest country, remains the biggest country for Opus Dei. And so, the book was always going to cause a splash there. And, it's, there was a lot of interest from the media. Well, I say there was a lot of interest from the media. There was a lot of interest from kind of half the media. And the other half, the publicist at the Spanish publishing company that was charged with basically trying to get word out about the book, she put out, a lot of press releases and offered interviews with me to anyone that wanted to talk to me. And, basically the left-leaning press were all very interested in this story and gave us some great coverage. The more kind of right-wing press basically just didn't want to talk to me, didn't want to engage with the book, wasn't interested in reading any of the advanced copies that were offered or whatever. And I kind of thought, well, fine. But then what was most interesting was that when the book came out, those same newspapers and TV channels and radio programs became vehicles for pushing this Opus Dei narrative. So they didn't engage with me in any way. They didn't want to hear what we were saying, but they were very happy to trot out the Opus Dei kind of angle inside of it. And, those things that we've just discussed about, me being like an anti-religious bigot and the rest of it, they were happy to push those lines, but didn't really want to engage with us. And it kind of gave me a window into how, I'm a journalist, I should know this, but it gave me more, maybe the UK media is slightly less kind of divided like this, but like it gave me a window into how the Spanish media operates and how influential Opus Dei still is in that world. We had big newspapers, newspapers like El Mundo and ABC, which are like two of the biggest selling newspapers in Spain, putting out these kind of Mia stories about me and the book without really engaging with me or giving me a chance to kind of what they were saying. It's basically kind of continuing this Opus Dei narrative. Another thing that happened in Spain as well was that Opus Dei tasked a Numeri with setting up an entire website, and they put up all these videos. You can check; they're on YouTube as well. There's an entire website where this guy, these expensive videos. Clearly, a lot of money and effort went into these videos, but basically put together a bunch of videos talking about how I'm a completely untrustworthy individual. You can't believe a word I say. It's kind of
so you've just been slandered completely. Essentially.
Yeah, but you know what? I think it's a window into how they operate. People aren't stupid.
Yeah.
And so I think,
it sort of says everything.
I don't necessarily think it's such a bad thing because like, this is what they're like, it's kind of confirms what I write about in the book, and the way that they do this indirectly, it confirms just how well they have infiltrated the world, the political worlds, the world media.
Yeah.
And, you guys are just confirming to the world what I've just written in the book. So go ahead.
That's so true. That's so true. There couldn't be a more obvious signal for that, and therefore confirmation of everything that you're saying in the first place.
There was a similar thing in the US, actually, which was rather extraordinary, which was, so I've had a bunch of reviews, almost all of which have been extremely positive. The Washington Post put out a glowing review of my book, which I was very pleased with. But then a few weeks later, the executive editor of the Washington Post, now, that's a very important job in Washington. He decided to write his own review of the book. So that the paper had already put out this really positive, this glowing review of the book. And He then took to writing a review in a Catholic newspaper. Well, his main criticism of my book was the fact that I hadn't said enough positive stuff about Opus Dei. And we're like, whoa! So that's your well. There's this book
Oh
which
my
is
God.
an expose of systematic abuse, of human trafficking, of really
Money
serious
laundering.
money laundering, really serious crimes. And your one takeaway is that I haven't said enough positive about Opus Dei. I'm sorry, it's not. If I'm writing an expose, it's not my job to like say, well, maybe they do a bit of positive stuff as well. But it also like confirms, like this guy would not be writing this if he wasn't already, I guess, part of this Opus Dei network and familiar with what Opus Dei does. So,
But also
it
a
can,
true believer.
so it confirms two things.
You're
One,
fighting against belief in some sense, and it's an insurmountable hill in many ways.
yeah, and it comes back to what we were saying before about the culture wars. I mean, these people have picked their side. They think that Opus Dei is a positive force, and they just want to stick their fingers in their ears. They don't want to hear about these heinous crimes that the organization has been involved in. But it also confirms, like the guy that's basically in charge of the Washington Post is a fan of Opus Dei.
That's
That
unbelievable. Yeah.
confirms what I was writing in the book. And also, he could have just remained quiet, but why stick your head above the parapet by writing it?
Mm.
I mean, the guy that wrote the original review of my book for the Washington Post, he was kind of posting on Blue Sky of he's like, what the hell's going on? They commissioned me to write a review. I did that in good faith. I thought the book was great. And then the boss of the paper is going out there undermining the newspaper's own reviewer by putting out his own separate review. It's kind of crazy. And I mean, they also placed, we had Newsweek, for example, and I know that, one of the senior members of staff at Newsweek is also a member of Opus Dei. The head of Opus Dei in the US put out some kind of op-ed in Newsweek and things. It just, when you see the PR machine cranking into action, you begin to get a glimpse as to just how wide the Opus Dei network is and just how successfully they've infiltrated many of the kind of big media platforms. And, yeah, I guess we can only imagine the breadth that they have in the political world as well.
They really punch above their weight, it sounds like. And especially to your point, if 800 of the luminaries of the 3,000 in America are in DC, if all of the Catholic conservative press, being half of which in Spain, aren't going to address your book, it is a more subtle confirmation of the exact influence campaigns that Opus try to play out for themselves that you write about. Therefore, it actually just supports your book. It's not good PR.
Absolutely. And I mean, the other interesting thing that's been happening over the last year has been what's been happening at the Vatican. Obviously, we had the death of Pope Francis at the end of April, a new pope, new American pope. And it's very interesting because literally, a couple of days before, so the reform, Francis has been trying to reform Opus Dei for a number of years. He basically put the group on notice back in 2022, told them to get their house in order, ordered them to rewrite their statutes. That's been going on for years. They've been dragging their feet. I mean, as I wrote about in the book, I think it was part of a strategy to wait for Francis to die. I mean, they thought if they dragged their feet long enough, he was getting on, his health wasn't the best. I think there was very much strategy to, hey, let's just try and get through this bit. Maybe the next pope is going to be a bit more friendly. If we just kind of drag this out, we might be able to avoid any real reform. Now, I mean, Francis, to his credits, kind of kept the pressure on them even whilst he was, not very well. And so, literally in the middle of April, we had this announcement where Opus Dei was about, the Vatican had finally kind of signed off on what was the final text of the Opus Dei reforms, and they had sent it back to Opus Dei for them to approve internally. Opus Dei was due to hold an internal vote to approve this kind of what the Vatican had told them they had to do. And then Francis died. Now, within hours of Francis dying, they cancelled the internal vote. So clearly they're thinking that was
Wow.
close. Let's try to, let's delay this again. We don't want to sign off on this text because maybe the next guy will be more amenable. When Pope Leo was elected, there was one of the very first things he did was call Opus Dei in to see him. So I guess
Wow.
and Opus Dei tried to spin that saying, it shows how close we are to the Pope, that he wanted to see us as one of his first audiences. But, I think it's become clear since that what he was doing was saying, what the hell are you guys playing at? Why have these
Good on him.
reforms taken so long? You need to sort this out. I mean, there was all kinds of leaks as well at the time. There was one leak that he'd given them 6 months to, get these reforms sorted out, or else he was going to close them down. And in more recent weeks, we've started to there are signs from the Vatican that some really serious reform is coming. It's on the horizon. There is one report that the Pope is actually about to disband Opus Dei. He's going to split them into 3 parts,
Wow.
which would be huge if true.
Devastating.
I mean, like I said before, we're recording this in November 2025. We think some kind of announcement is imminent. It could be, any day now. We're waiting. So that's positive. At the same time, behind the scenes, I've been working with a group of Opus Dei victims to try to get an audience with the Pope. We believe that it's quite concerning that throughout this whole period of reforming Opus Dei, which has been going on for like 3-4 years now, at no point has the Vatican reached out to myself, to other journalists that have covered Opus Dei, or to any of the victims or any former members. And we're really, seriously concerned that the Vatican doesn't fully understand how this group operates. There's the official statutes, the official constitution of Opus Dei, which was signed off by the Vatican, but there are all of these hidden, these secret rule books that we have access to, but the Vatican doesn't. And so, we believe we have information that the Vatican needs in order to make full, a real reform, but they don't want to hear us. So I think on the one hand, there are positive steps. It looks like the Pope's about to do something, but at the same time, the Pope is ignoring calls, from people like us. We have information. We can help them to make better reforms. But it's almost like the church doesn't want to dig too deeply into this because it's perhaps worried about what it might find. I mean, I know, I'm absolutely
They don't have
serious.
to scratch far.
What happened in the US in the early 2000s has really scarred the church. What began as a very kind of localized scandal in Boston then became national and international. And the repercussions for the church in terms of the number of people going to mass, in terms of financial compensation, and then bankruptcies of various kind of dioceses around the world, I think that's very much in their mind whenever a new big international scandal kind of pops up.
Yeah,
so I think the church is trying to kind of have its cake and eat it. They're trying to be seen to be reforming Opus Dei, doing something about this problem, but they don't really want to kind of get into the weeds for fear of what they might find and the repercussions, financial and otherwise, that might result.
Yeah, were the Vatican to legitimize your work by speaking with you and taking into account your information for a potential reform, it would further confirm the reputation they have, which is that it's all about money and power and not necessarily about belief in this entire morality system that it's supposed to be about.
No, absolutely. This is about power and about money. It's about, the church is meant to be an institution that kind of pushes these kind of Christian values of love and charity, repentance, repenting for your sins and making amends. But I mean, what we're seeing is basically, I think it's quite clear that Pope Leo, I think he probably has a good heart. He wants to do the right thing, But part of his job is protecting the institution that he's now the head of. And so I think whilst on the one hand, he does want to do something about Opus Dei, he doesn't want to kick up too much of a stink, because that then has potentially has very serious repercussions for the institution that he is in charge of.
Totally.
We don't want to lose, millions of followers. They don't want to end up in a much deeper financial problems. So I guess he's trying to balance the two things. But, unfortunately, in my eyes, it just sends out the wrong message. It sends out the message that the church is more interested in power and money than it is in actually, pushing these Christian values.
Yeah. I mean, the cynicism's already dialed up to higher than it's ever been. I can see from the Vatican's perspective why you would just want to ignore the Opus Dei problem and hope it sort of goes away rather than address it front on. Do you suspect that Pope Leo, he's an American, right?
Yes, he is.
Do you suspect he's read your book?
I know he has discussed my book with people. I got a message a few weeks back with someone that had an audience with the Pope, where he said, "I've been talking about your book with the Pope. I recommended that he read it," which it's kind of a slightly surreal WhatsApp.
That's so surreal
to be getting. I do not know if the Pope has read the book, but he is certainly aware of it, let's say. I hope he reads the book. I think he may well learn important information if he does. I stand ready to meet with him, or any of the people that he wants me to meet with, to share information that I have. But it's been months since we sent that offer to the Pope, and we're still waiting to hear back. If you as an institution realize that you have a problem and you want to do something about it, you want to reform, what you need is information, and all the information you can get your hands on. If you have a group of people, former members, victims, journalists, who know this institution inside out and who've offered their services to you to give you documents that they have to explain, the reality of how this institution works. If you have these people coming to you, then you welcome them with open arms. You say, please give it. I mean, they're free to take the information we have and then say, this isn't right, or ignore it or whatever. But to completely ignore us and not even want to listen to what we have to say or read the information that we have to provide is extraordinary and actually quite telling, I think.
I've brought your story up a number of times in the context of Serendipity. Here's this guy, Gareth Gore, who's a financial journalist, and he's been sent to cover the collapse of this financial institution, Banco Popular, and from the rubble is the journalist who breaks the story with all the right sources on Opus Dei. This, whether you call it a cult or not, but giant...
We should call it a cult, yeah.
Okay, this pernicious cult, fictionalized by Dan Brown, that was on people's lips, but they didn't quite know what it was. And here you are now, your book's being discussed with the Pope. There was a HBO series made on top of your book. It is all so wonderful. And I wonder whether you've had the time to let that really sink in the years since, just how much that serendipitous moment has shaped the future of everything you do in your career.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I think a huge amount of work has gone into the book. I mean, 5-6 years of my life reporting, spending literally days, weeks in the archives, hundreds and hundreds of phone calls and Zoom meetings and thousands of hours of research and writing and stuff. But you're absolutely right. I mean, serendipity plays a huge role here. I would never have set out on that journey if it weren't for the fact that this bank just suddenly collapsed and that I was sent to report on it. I think, so yeah, I mean, I count myself very lucky to have just accidentally fallen into this rabbit hole. But I think as a journalist, that is often the way these things happen. I think, we all have kind of beats that we cover. And so we're covering stuff that happens in that world. And most of the time you write a story, you move on. But occasionally you'll come across something, or you'll meet someone, often completely unexpectedly. Some of the best, I interview people day in, day out, and, often you'll talk about, a particular story you're working on, and you'll move on. But sometimes at the end of that conversation or in the middle of the conversation, they'll just drop in some kind of nugget, and that leads to an incredible story or whatever. I mean, serendipity is kind of part of being a journalist. You hope, you dream of these moments. And yeah, I mean, but that's what life is as well, I guess. No, I mean, there are so many,
Absolutely.
so many points in life where if you'd done something slightly different, it would have led to a completely different outcome. Who I am, who we are today is, basically the culmination of millions of different choices, and, many of which were accidental choices or we didn't really put much thought into. But it's just, yeah, that's life, I guess.
And Australia, there was the infamous fire scene from the book, but has there been any political ramification in Australia because of Opus and your book?
um I don't believe so. I mean, there are a bunch of Australian politicians, Perrottet and the I think a former prime minister was also affiliated to, was Abbott maybe affiliated to Opus Dei? I'm not
Wouldn't
sure,
surprise me. He's
but
definitely that archetype.
yes. So I think I mean, okay, I should say I don't know for
I don't know.
certain, but
Okay, no problem. No problem.
I think he's been linked. Um, but yeah, again, I think within a certain kind of, within certain groups in the kind of Sydney, Canberra kind of political worlds, I think Opus Dei has a sizable presence. They have these two schools just outside of Sydney. Redfield is the school for boys, and Tangara is the school for girls. And there have been, I mean, they amazingly still attract the kids of the kind of Australian political and business elite. But there've been
This
all
is
these
possible.
scandals linked to linked to the schools. I mean, the ABC put out this excellent documentary called Purity a few years back, where a bunch of girls were talking about like horrendous stuff that was going on at the schools. Where I think in science class or something, that the teacher passed around a piece of sticky tape, and by the end of after it had made its way all around the room and it was kind of covered in fluff and bits or whatever, the science teacher then held up this tape and said, this is what will happen to your bodies if you decide to sleep around. You need to keep
Yep.
yourself. And all these girls as well were, the girls were basically discouraged from taking the HPV vaccine, which we all know prevents cancer. They were told they didn't need to take the vaccine because they would only ever have one sexual partner in their lives, their husband. Um,
Wow.
Completely ignoring the fact that they could contract this virus from that one sexual partner. So they, even if you only ever had one sexual partner in your life, you were still at risk of contracting this
Yeah.
cancer causing virus. Yet this was the kind of logic of the girls not taking it. And also at the boys' school, I mean, extraordinary report as well. I think it was in the Sydney Morning Herald or whatever. One of the boys alleged that he'd been invited to these special clubs after school, these special homework clubs, and this homework club was at the local Opus Dei residence. And whilst he was there, he found a list of boys' names. And these were boys who were like 12, 13 years old. And the nunneries at the residence had basically made a note next to each of the boys' names about the potential benefits that each of the boys might offer to Opus Dei and the potential disadvantages. Basically, they were compiling notes on these young boys, how to recruit them, what they might offer to Opus Dei. It's really kind of dark stuff. Yet, at the same time, these schools continue to attract the kids of the wealthy and the powerful.
It's unbelievable, mate. I cannot square how there's so much religious conservatism in Australia because you don't really see it. But that honestly might be the case everywhere around the world. It's so siloed off into communities that you don't necessarily see it unless you are a part of it. And then once you're a part of it, maybe you can't make sense for why the rest of the country is thinking X, Y, Z over their issues. The culture wars again.
And I think we're seeing a lot of political. We're seeing a lot of people using religion as a political vehicle as well for whatever ideologies they might be pushing. I mean, we're seeing this in the US, in the UK as well. People are embracing things like Christianity and Catholicism as a way of creating an identity which is anti-migrant and anti-diverse. It's like, we
So
good,
true.
we good Catholics, let's, they're almost
Yeah.
kind of hitching their wagons to the
Yeah.
church.
Judeo-Christian ethic that informed my culture and my society, and these are my justifications for why I don't want people to be coming into my country anymore.
The Pope himself has called out this kind of way of thinking, like, no, you as good Christians, you should be embracing migrants. You should be looking after your neighbor, not turning your backs on these people.
Yeah,
But,
well, you listen to Tucker Carlson, it's the exact opposite.
well,
He's
exactly.
using that exact line of reasoning as a
But
reason why
the Pope, to
Americans
his
is for
credit,
America.
I've criticized Pope Leo for maybe not wanting to dig into the Opus Dei scandal enough and for ignoring calls from our group to be heard. But to his credit, on these other issues, he is calling out this hypocrisy of supposed Christians. And so that's, good on him for doing that. But I think, it's all about creating it's using, and Opus Dei has done this all along, it's using religion and Christianity and Catholicism to create an identity that then justifies things and also sets you apart from either migrants or Muslims or atheists or, the kind of progressive liberal elite or whatever. It's, we are different from them and we're guided by these higher values or whatever. It's, it's dark stuff.
Gareth, anything that you experience in your day-to-day or feel like is necessary to speak about, with the context being is the political ramifications from your book that we didn't touch on today?
No, I think we've done a pretty good job of covering the fallout. Yeah, I mean, I just right now just wake up every day wondering if today's the day that the Pope will make his big announcement. I think it's
Cool.
imminent. Um, although that said, this is a 2,000-year-old institution. It doesn't work very quickly, and so when I say imminent, we could be talking 6 months here or something or more. But it looks like action is coming, and I look forward to. I think that's going to be an important moment for the book as well, because I think a lot of people, I think parts of the mainstream press have been slightly hesitant, I think, about digging into this too much or giving too much coverage to the book because of the kind of campaign that Opus Dei has mounted against it, because of all of this kind of the smear campaign against me, but also because this is tricky ground. And I think a lot of media don't want to be seen as kind of anti-religious, even when you've got all of this abuse in kind of plain sight. And so I think if the Vatican comes down hard on Opus Dei, it will be a vindication of what I and many others have been saying. And so I'm hopeful that the mainstream media this might be an opportunity for the mainstream media to finally kind of get its teeth into some of these allegations and speak about them more widely. So yeah, my hope is that when it comes, it will be a great opportunity to really shed a much brighter light on these issues. I mean, the work that you're doing, giving me a platform to talk about this, and there are many others like you, but I'm still waiting for the call from the New York Times or from the BBC or whatever. A lot of those.
The BBC haven't picked it up.
Yes. So yes,
Unbelievable. It's perplexing to me because it's such a rich, pure story. How do you make sense of that?
It is interesting. I mean, I think we shouldn't necessarily read any kind of malice or conspiracy into this. I think journalists are busy. This is a complex story. Like you basically need to read the book too. And that's not me just plugging, but I think to really kind of understand the organization, it's hard to get that across in the press release or whatever. You kind of need to read the book to really kind of fully understand. And that was clear in, the last podcast I did with you, which we talked for like, I think almost 2 hours. But it was clear, you'd read the book and you had some really great questions. I think a lot of journalists are under acute pressure to kind of churn out stories as quickly as possible. So they just don't have the time to get the teeth into something like this. And so it's kind of easy to be like, we're going to pass on that because that's going to require a bit too much work to really kind of understand. There are far easier stories to cover. And so I think breaking into the news cycle is hard sometimes, because especially with a complex story like this. So I think that's part of it. But I do think a lot of them are also, we're pretty, the title of the book has, you know, dark money, it has human trafficking, it's got right-wing conspiracy. They are pretty punchy
Oh yeah,
allegations.
they're punchy.
And so I think, the media that probably puts some of the media off as well, because they're like,
Okay.
do we really kind of want to stick our necks out on this? And so, yeah, I mean, but like I said, I'm hopeful that when we get an announcement from the Vatican, that will create space.
Yeah,
It will
makes sense.
people to cover this. We will see.
Cool. Well, Gareth, once again, mate, can't thank you enough for being so generous with your time. And everyone listening to this will find links to the book in the description. But also, listen to the first episode if this piques your interest at all and you've never heard of Opus Dei, because Gareth has an incredible story to tell. And to be fair, the story of Opus Dei is also just fantastic. It's so ambitious and they nailed it. And, take it or leave it. It's really interesting.
Thanks for having me on, Ryan. It's been a pleasure.